question and the answer is not very far. The song of the sages, the knowledge of the ages is living where you reside. You have the key that unlocks the door to enter in that sacred place you haven't gone before, where deep meets deep, soul to soul. Feel that connection as the truth unfolds. I am. Yes, you are the key that unlocks the door to freedom and leads you to me. Look deep inside. It knows the way. Yeah, there's no separation. We're one and the same. A child of the Creator, known by different names. Alpha and Omega, the eternal flame that burns deep inside you. Do you know my name? I am. From the mountains to the oceans, I am. From the rocks to the trees, I am. All the stars and constellations, I am. You are. To the oceans, I am. From the rocks to the trees, I am. All the stars and constellations, I am. And you are, yeah. I'm spiritual, mystical, I am mystical. I am love. I am love, 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 love. From the very low to the heavens above, I There's no separation. We're one in the same, a child of the Creator, known by different names. The Alpha and Omega, the eternal flame. It burns deep inside you. Do you know my name? I am. From the mountains to the ocean, I am. From the rocks to the trees, yes, I am. And constellations, I am, you are, we are, yeah. The peace that passes all understanding, I am. The joy that's overflowing, I am the love in abundance, I am, and you are.
Watching God grow up. What in the hell does that mean? I was talking to someone the other day about how strange it is to find myself at this point in my life where I am. I was raised in a non-religious home, no church. It wasn't negative or positive, it just wasn't there. At the age of 19 and a half, I had a very powerful spiritual awakening that I was not looking for, and got on this path. And since that moment in my 19th year, I have been fascinated by this thing called God. And I've been on a roller coaster in that pursuit. I went to a couple of different seminaries, taught for a while in a seminary, worked with the church for 5 years, left at about 1990, found this New Thought movement through Jim Munson, and went out after I left the church, started building houses for about 10 years, and drank a lot of tequila, and tried everything that I thought I had missed, and I had missed it, and found nothing there. But I went through all of life. So some of you, after an introduction like that, might think that I'm some sort of saint or, some sort of academic that spent my life studying this stuff. When I was in high school, I had a grade point average of about 1.2 because I didn't care. My first 2 years of college, or year and a half, grade point was about 1.8, so it went up a little bit. And then after I had the spiritual experience, the grade point went from 1.8 to 3.8 because I suddenly had a focal point and I had a complete change of heart and was curious about every frickin' thing in the world. Everything. Not just religion, but everything. So I studied, and I did a lot of different kinds of spiritual practices ranging from evangelical Christianity to rebirthing and all the New Agey stuff. John Bradshaw, all of that stuff. And so it's been a real journey and a lot of different pursuits. And what I found myself wrestling with in all the different permutations of my life and lifestyle and explorations from one end to the other is the question, what is God? Where is God? Is God in the church? Is God outside the church? Where's it all at? A few years ago, I came across a letter written by John Keats, the 19th century poet, who died at about the age of 25, 26 of tuberculosis. A horrible death. And in a letter he wrote about a year before he died, he wrote to his brother and he said this. And imagine a man, 25 years old, who knows he's got about a year left to live. And he wrote this. He said, "Call this world, if you please, the vale of soul making. Then you'll find out the use of this world." He says, "I say soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of divinity in millions." I want to repeat that. There may be soul or intelligences or sparks of divinity in millions, but they are not yet souls until they become individual selves. How then, he asked, do these sparks of God become individual souls? How then but by a world like this? And in the letter he goes on to talk about his theory that this world, with all of the stuff that I had been through, that's what I got from his reference there, but by moving through a world like this, which means everything in this world, these little sparks of divinity, and that's the phrase I want to focus on here for a moment, these little sparks of divinity that every child, every baby comes into this world with that little spark of divinity and then grows up biologically, psychologically, spiritually, to become a unique self. You all know, sitting here in this room today, if you look around, if we were all suddenly snapped my fingers and we were all the babies that we were, 6 weeks old, sitting here, just imagine this is a big nursery. We would all look a lot more similar, right? I mean, babies have their distinctions, but in general, seen one, you've seen them all, unless they're yours, of course. But now we're all unique individuals because we've been through this world, some longer than others. But as we move through it, we become, as Keith said, unique individuals through the multitudes of experiences we have externally and emotionally or intellectually internally. So that's what I want to focus on. And in our workshop this afternoon for a couple of hours, for those who want to go into this more deeply and have more of a dialogue around it, we will. But this is an introduction. Is it possible? And I'm asking that question because this is a new thought church, so I can have a new thought. It may not be that new. I don't think it is, actually. But is it possible that the spark of divinity that Keats is talking about is the little seed pod that is in each child that develops an identity that we call an ego? Because the word ego in Greek merely means what? I. So we become a little I. What if God is that little seed pod of ego that each of us is? What if God is the ego? Does that sound weird to anybody? Have you ever heard that before? What if? I said this one church elsewhere, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "That's blasphemy." She said, "I didn't think I'd ever hear myself calling somebody blasphemous in a unity church, but that's blasphemy." Says the ego is our enemy. I said, "You've been reading too many self-help books." Tongue in cheek, but in a way serious, because oftentimes in this culture we have this notion that the ego is our enemy and that we're trying to find God. I've heard some very famous people say the acronym for ego, E-G-O, is, have you heard this? Edging God out. And if you don't think about that, the implication is that the ego is separate from God because it's edging God out. And I get that metaphor, but what if it's edging God outward? See the difference? Because one starts with the idea that that little spark of divinity that I am when I am born is sort of separate from God, and that God is out here trying to get in, but as my ego grows, I'm pushing God away. What if God is in, as Keith said, in that spark of ego, and that God is that thing that makes me suckle, that makes me grasp the finger, that makes me move and squirm and grow musculature and skeletal frame and all of those desires moving through and in me as a little baby and as a young child and as an adolescent where the desires go on fire? What if all those desires are designed by the Infinite One to move us or move it outward? You see what I'm saying? What if all of these things that we do in life, from religious to non-religious, from profane to the mundane, right? All of life is a process of moving God outward. My father, who became a Christian about the age of 47, and we still talk about this, he's still in basically the same church he was in and thriving. But he has said to me several times, "Michael," he said, "what we need to do is we need to get out there and let all these people know about God the way I know God now." And I said, "Dad, what about the first 47 years of your life? What was going on then?" He said, "Well, I was ignorant of God." I said, "Well, who made you ignorant of God?" "Well, I don't know, but I was. Must have been me." I say, what a horrible view of the world, right? To think that I am to blame for not understanding God the way I do yesterday. You understand what I'm saying? What if, and I posed this to you as I have to my father, I said, what if this thing we call the Holy Spirit, or whatever names you want to use, is that thing in you for 47 years that sort of was nudging you as you used some free will to make choices and was nudging you through a path of all kinds of experiences in order to develop you like a flower from a seed? He said, "Oh, I don't believe that." I said, "Well, that's what Jesus taught." I said, "What?" I said, "Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. That's what Jesus taught." Jesus told them a parable that I've never heard anyone speak about before. And he said to a group of people, and I'm imagining with this group of people that he was surrounded by a lot of religious teachers, which I am. So I imagine myself there. And he said to this group of people in Mark chapter 4, as it's reported, he said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who plants a seed in the field. Got that image? And the farmer, after he gets done, goes to his house and he sleeps. And the seed in the ground grows while he sleeps, all by itself. The Greek is automate, and you get the word, automatic. Whether the farmer sleeps or wakes, the seed grows all by itself. From the seed comes a little shoot out of the soil, and then a stalk, and then the buds on the stalk, and then the full bloom, and then the harvest. You get the image? So Jesus seems to be saying that the kingdom of heaven grows like a seed in what way? All by itself. There's something he doesn't understand as a mere human, that there is an automate, an automatic spiritual power going on in the seed and in the human soul, kingdom of heaven, that moves it to its destination. You get that image? What if each of you sitting here today, each of us, has from the moment of our existence, define that however you will, the moment of our existence, there was a spiritual spark, as Keith said, of divinity in us, moving us through the stages of spiritual development, just as a flower moves through the stages of its development. What value does that place on life and life experiences? That idea. What value does it place on life experiences? It means then that just as the soil creates the bed for that seed to develop, what's the equivalent in a spiritual paradigm to the soil for us as souls? If we are soul seeds, what is our soil? Life, this world. Well, most of it anyway. No, what if it's all? So this has given me the idea that maybe, and I started to read the Bible this way, and I've started teaching it this way, and teach 2 classes here every year, and I decided to do this talk for those of you that will never take that class because you hate the Bible. Anybody out there like, come on, tell the truth? When I first started teaching the Bible here, I told the folks in the education department, I said, I think I'd like to call this class The Bible for Those Who Hate the Bible. I don't teach it the way you normally hear it. I teach it as a story, a narrative that begins in Genesis with the soul seed of Adam, the androgynous being, by the way, it's neither male nor female initially, being planted in the Garden of Eden, and that's why the garden metaphor is there. That the soul is planted in the Garden of Eden, and that the soul bursts out of its little seed form into an ego. That Adam and Eve are the initial egos, and that each of us is that Adam and Eve ego. And from there, the story moves on. And in fact, I teach it in such a way that says the book of Genesis is that stage of God development where even God is an ego. You understand that? Because if you read Genesis, you find that not only are all the people in Genesis self-obsessed, because that's what ego does, right? Ego is self-obsessed. And that's great, because when you're a little baby, you need to be self-obsessed. If you don't cry to get changed and fed and all that sort of thing, you'll be neglected. So the ego identity is the first stage of spiritual growth, is very important. What if God is a self-obsessed, territorial egomaniac in Genesis? Anybody get mad at that? Probably not here. The God of Genesis is a terror, like a 2-year-old. I mean, you've got the flood, right? You read that story? The flood, they're bad, let's drown them. Right? They build a Tower of Babel, they're trying to get up to God, and God says, let's confuse them, scatter them the hell out of here, give them all different languages. I don't want them near me. Adam and Eve are in the garden, they eat from the tree. God says, get out. Don't want you here anymore. Ego. I mean, the Genesis story is a story of ego, and that's the way I read it. But I don't read it as an evil kind of thing. Ego is not evil. Ego is merely the first stage of growth. I got this idea. Scott Peck, the different drum, Scott Peck, the author, wrote The Different Drum, and he suggested there are 4 stages of spiritual growth. He said the first stage is the ego stage. He calls it chaotic antisocial. He calls it chaotic antisocial because he says in this stage of growth, you have to get an identity because you're self-obsessed and it's all about me, it's all about me, it's all about me. But there comes a point in your maturing process where all about me just doesn't work any longer. You understand? So he said what happens if you don't evolve beyond the ego is that your life becomes chaotic and antisocial. You ever been around people that are ego obsessed? Have you ever been one? People can't stand you after a while. They just can't. It's like it's all about me. I talk about me, enough about me. Let's hear what you think about me, that sort of thing. It works until it doesn't. So this is the first stage of godness in Genesis. Chaotic antisocial. But Scott Peck says there's a second stage that comes after the ego stage, which he calls the formal institutional stage. I call it the we-go stage, because you move out of self-obsession to being obsessed with self and something else that you connect to yourself. That's stage 2. In the Bible, that starts with the book of Exodus, the second book. After Genesis and egoism, Israel goes up to Mount Sinai. Moses gives them the law, gives them a tent, gives them priests, gives them all kinds of frickin' laws and rituals and regulations, and says, no, now go out and be a community. So the second stage of God's growth in the Bible moves from the ego in Genesis to what I call the we-go, or the relational stage. In our lives, mostly this happens big time in adolescence. Because in adolescence, this thing our culture calls hormones kicks in, and the hormones change the way we start to view the world, no? Yes. What happens when the hormones kick in? Well, I mean, not specifically, but we start noticing things about others, and it's not infrequent that we have the experience of falling in love. And Marianne Williamson, in one of her books, puts it beautifully. She says, romantic love is a wonderful experience because it allows the little ego circle to break open long enough to attach to another and get out of itself. It's wonderful. Formal institutional. What do you want? Oh, no. What do you want? Right? Falling in love. Sometimes people join the military as a formal institutional experience. That's their Mount Sinai with the laws, the rules, and the regulations. Sometimes they go to college and they pay frickin' teachers to make them study. Sometimes they get married. Marriage is a great formal institutional experience, stage 2. It's like, I love you, we'll love each other forever. Let's get married, move in together, and see what happens. So that stage of God in the Old Testament, moving from ego to ego plus or ego expanding, is in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That whole section sees God get bigger. It's not really God, though. It's the human soul, that spark moving out. Scott Peck says, however, that this formal institutional phase comes to an end just like the ego phase. Because inevitably, in any relationship you get into with another, whether it's a job or a person or whatever, there comes that day or that morning where you wake up, you pop an eye open, and you see that person. I'm not saying this happens to anybody here, but you pop an eye open and you look and you think, really? Do I really want to be here with you? Now, we don't talk about this, right? But it happens, does it not? Yes. And the other one has probably done it a few days before, so don't get, too big about it. Now, this, according to Scott Peck and the biblical narrative and all the other world's religions, which we'll talk about today, how this works in other religions in the workshop, this is normal and natural. It is a phase of development, just as the seed pops a little shoot out of the ground and grows the stalk into stage 2 and pops the buds. The buds are this stage 3 experience of starting to question every frickin' thing around you. Scott Peck calls it skeptic individuation. He said there comes a phase in a person's life, it usually hits big time between about 30 and 40, 35, 45. In fact, Carl Jung says we spend the first 35 years of our life growing an ego and the second 35 getting rid of it. So there's this third stage of consciousness that comes along and makes us start questioning everything. Do I really believe this stuff anymore? Am I really in love with you? Maybe we should talk. Maybe we should separate. Maybe I should leave this job. I'm sick of this job. I used to love it. Now I hate it. I hate the car. I hate the house. I hate everything around me. I hate me. I hate who I am. I hate how I dress. No, I'm not talking personally here, but you understand. Scott Peck calls this the skeptic individuation stage. And in the Bible, it shows up with King David. After you move from Moses, you get to King David. King David is a rebel. Moses in stage 2, formal institutional, says, if you commit adultery, then what? Kill him. Guess what David does? He commits adultery. And what happens to him? He writes a psalm and says, I'm sorry. Psalm 32, Psalm 51, he basically apologizes. I really didn't mean it. And what happens? Nothing. So David, when you look at the life of David, he questions everything that Moses taught. The book of Job shows up about this time. It questions everything that Moses taught. So this third mode of consciousness, we all go through it, is one of falling apart. The pharmaceutical company has made billions on this mode of consciousness. You understand? I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying this culture has implied, basically, that this stage of consciousness is not legitimate. It's not divine. There's nothing good in it. You just need to get fixed. But a bigger picture suggests that this disintegration, this questioning, this I don't know who I am anymore, I don't know where I belong, is a part of the process of divinity expanding itself. Scott Peck says the fourth stage of consciousness is what he calls mystic communal. He said this stage 3 disintegration, questioning, skepticism, wondering about everything comes to an end because it's exhausting. You ever notice that? It's exhausting. And it typically will wear a person down to the point of saying, I give up. And he says, then they're ready for the mystical opening. But they can't get to the mystical opening typically until they've been through some ego experiences, some relational or social experiences, and some disintegrative experiences. Mode 4 happens usually at the end of the disintegrative experience. Now, I'd venture to guess if we took a poll here this morning that most of you showed up at this church looking for something in a disintegrative state of consciousness. Yes? All right, let's do the altar call. Come forward. That's why altar calls work. I'm not mocking it. That's why altar calls work, because people come to crusades or whatever they are in a state of disintegration, and when there's a preacher up there standing saying, you know, your life is falling apart, people going, bobblehead. Yes. Now, if you come forward, you can have a spiritual solution. Stage 4 is mystic communal, and in the Bible, it occurs in the New Testament, where Jesus shows up and he says, you've been through the law, you've been through ego, you've been through disintegration, now blessed are the poor in spirit. In other words, now you can see that in that place of disintegration, there is a place where God shows up in a special way in that mode of disintegration and will open up the kingdom in a way to you that you could never see it prior to that. So I'm going to close, but the idea here, and we're going to explore it more this afternoon, is that every phase of life and every mode of consciousness that you can see through is potentially divine. Can I do a quick prayer as we close here? Let's just do a sort of heart piece to this. If you'd like to join with me, eyes closed, take a breath. Nice deep breath. Relax. Relax, relax. And this morning we open to to the possibility that our spiritual life began with our existence. That as a child, as a baby, as an adolescent, as someone raised in a home with chaos, addiction, all the things that happen to us. What if that's all part of the soil of bringing you to the mystical union with the infinite lover of your soul? And as Keats said, by the time this journey is completed, each of us is as unique and distinct as any thumbprint. I bless you this morning on the journey wherever you are, wherever we are. And so it is. Amen.